Gold cities don't build themselves, and apparently neither do successful expeditions, a lesson Spain kept relearning at considerable human expense. Welcome to Chapter 5 of The Rise the Limit, beyond 7 cities battered at Pensacola, where Coronado trades mythical riches for a bruising reality check, and Tristán de Luna follows up by sailing a fleet directly into a hurricane's opinion of his colonization plans. The real twist. A woman taken from Cusa 20 years earlier, now fluent in Spanish and considerably wiser than the men in charge, may have been the only person on the Gulf Coast who actually knew what she was doing. The fallout from Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's miraculous survival did not stop at Hernando de Soto's disastrous march through the southeast. The rumors he carried also drifted west, sparking a parallel frenzy. Standing on the quartz dunes of the Florida coast today, it is strange to consider how a Gulf shipwreck rippled out to the high desert. I remember a past detour on a road trip, parked right where Highway 53 meets the dusty wash of the Zuni River in New Mexico. Just past the reservation boundary, beyond a faded sign warning of flash floods, early 16th century explorers somehow managed to look at a dusty pueblo and see a skyline made of bullion. When I stood there, the landscape before me was composed entirely of beige dirt and slightly darker beige dirt. This is where the fever dream of the American Southwest truly began. It was an enterprise born not of discovery, but of a desperate need to believe that an empty horizon was actually hiding a receipt for reimbursement. The catalyst for this grand delusion was that same group of 4 bedraggled pedestrians who survived the Narvaez expedition in Florida and wandered out of the Texas wilderness in 1536. Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions had walked across the continent, peddling healing services and vague promises. They had not actually seen gold. They had simply heard stories about it, which in the 16th century was practically a bank deposit. They spoke of large and forceful villages to the north. The imperial grapevine quickly transmuted these conversational scraps into the 7 cities of Cibola. Smelling profit, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza dispatched a friar named Marcos de Niza in 1539 to scout the area. He utilized Estevanico, the enslaved African survivor from the Narvaez trek, as his advance guard. Estevanico was a man of immense capability who had survived shipwrecks and starvation across thousands of miles. He reached the Zuni village of Hawiku well ahead of the friar. The locals killed him. Fray Marcos then displayed the courageous prudence of a middle manager avoiding liability and viewed the village from a very safe distance. He returned to Mexico City with a report that can only be described as creative fiction. He claimed the city was larger than Mexico City itself and shimmering with wealth. It was a fabrication so audaciously grand, it effectively turned a pile of mud bricks into an impeccably forged financial prospectus. Based on this phantom intelligence, Viceroy Mendoza appointed Francisco Vásquez de Coronado to lead the venture. It was a sprawling logistical undertaking. A moving city of 300 Spaniards and over 1,000 indigenous allies from Mexico marched out of Compostela in 1540. The participants funded the expedition almost entirely themselves. Coronado mortgaged his wife's estate. Other men bet their entire fortunes. Their hearts pounded with the rhythm of compound interest as they tracked the trail of a friar who was about to become the most unpopular man in the hemisphere. When the army finally reached Hawiku in July 1540, the bubble burst with audible violence. There was no gold. There were no silver-lined streets. They found only a modest farming community and some very confused Zuni residents. The soldiers realized their financial ruin was imminent. They hurled curses at Fray Marcos with such vigor that Coronado had to ship the friar back to Mexico for his own safety. Yet the threat of bankruptcy loomed over the expedition like a thunderhead made of unpaid ledger entries. This relentless pressure rendered the conquistadors' subsequent behavior as ruthlessly destructive as creditors facing geographic insolvency. Trying to salvage the mission, Coronado moved the army to the Rio Grande. They occupied the Tiguex pueblos for the winter of 1540 and 1541. What followed was the Tiguex War, a brutal series of sieges and battles that permanently scarred relations in the valley. The Spaniards needed food and warmth. The locals needed the Spaniards to leave. It was a violent eviction notice served in reverse. During this grim winter, hoping to find a navigable waterway to the sea, Coronado sent a side party under Garcia López de Cárdenas to the west. They stumbled upon the Grand Canyon. The Spaniards stood on the rim of one of the world's greatest natural wonders and looked down. They saw that the river was entirely inaccessible and utterly useless for shipping loot. Consequently, they promptly classified the majestic ravine as a disappointing logistical hazard. Desperation makes for gullible leadership. In 1541, the expedition sat for a fireside chat with a plains native they nicknamed El Turco, the Turk. He spun a yarn about a place called Quivira to the east. He claimed it was a city so wealthy that commoners ate off gold plates. Another guide named Isopete essentially flagged El Turco as a liar. Despite the warnings, Coronado bit the hook. The army marched onto the Great Plains. They traversed the Llano Estacado. They encountered the Palo Duro Canyon. They marveled at the herds of buffalo, describing them as hump-backed cows. The landscape otherwise offered nothing but grass and sky. When they finally reached Quivira, located in what is now central Kansas, the cosmic joke was complete. Quivira was a collection of proto-Wichita villages with thatched huts and excellent corn. It suffered a severe shortage of precious metals. The trusted guide confessed he had led them there to die in the wilderness. This strategic deception earned him a swift execution by garrote. The return to the Rio Grande for the winter of 1541 and 1542 was a somber affair. The army was broken, the debt was crushing, morale was non-existent. Then, to add physical injury to financial insult, Coronado suffered a severe fall from his horse during a festival. He sustained a head injury that left him incapacitated. In April 1542, the command faced the reality that the only thing they had conquered was their own credit rating. They voted to return to New Spain. They began the long, dusty retreat. They left behind a vast, newly mapped territory devoid of treasure, much like Don Quixote turning his back on windmills that refused to be giants. Among these retreating ranks, however, were ambitious junior officers who refused to accept complete temporal defeat. They would soon carry their hardened frontier tactics away from the desert, looking back toward the hurricane-swept coasts of La Florida. Luna's gamble. A viceroy's vision sets sail. Tristán de Luna y Arellano was one of those ambitious junior officers. The Coronado expedition had exported nothing but bruised egos and bankrupt bank accounts, leaving the Spanish Empire with a lingering, metallic taste of failure in its mouth. Was this sufficiently discouraging to halt the imperial machine from grinding more men into the dust of the northern frontier? Absolutely not. The Crown simply reloaded the cannon. This time they packed it with a man who understood that glory is 10% inspiration and 90% paperwork. I have devoted arguably too much of my fleeting mortality to studying the bureaucratic sinews of Don Tristán. While the swashbucklers get the statues, the administrators actually move the luggage. Nobody moved luggage quite like him. Born into the Castilian nobility around 1510, he arrived in New Spain with a resume that screams upper management. He was a cousin to Viceroy Luis de Velasco and married into the family of Hernán Cortés. This lineage proved that while talent is nice, having a 16th century Rolodex filled with the most powerful men in the hemisphere is better. Before he was tasked with taming La Florida, Luna cut his teeth on the jagged mistakes of the past. He had served as a captain of horse during that debacle with Coronado, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant general. Coronado was off playing the lead in a tragedy of his own making, galloping ahead to execute guides and stare disappointedly at Kansas thatch. Luna was the grown-up left behind to command the main army. He dragged the provisions and the infantry through the deep snows of Tegex. He kept the expedition alive while his boss fell off a horse and sustained a traumatic brain injury. Luna's superpower was not finding gold. His superpower was mobilizing men and supplies across hellish distances without losing his mind. By the late 1550s, the Spanish crown had developed a nervous tic regarding the French. French forces were eyeing the Atlantic coast with larcenous intent. The mandate came down in 1559 to establish a colony. The strategic genius of this plan, confirmed by a royal order that I have examined with the reverence usually reserved for Holy Scripture, was the route. They intended to build a settlement at Pensacola Bay, known then as Ochuse. From there, they would push inland to the chiefdom of Coosa and eventually link overland to Santa Elena on the South Carolina coast. It was to be a transcontinental belt of Spanish forts. The planners envisioned a geopolitical keep-out sign hammered into the continent. Viceroy Velasco decided to fund this venture with manic generosity. Perhaps trying to compensate for the frugal embarrassments of previous conquistadors, he operated with "shut up and take my money" energy and promised to bankroll the towns for 3 years. This was not a ragtag group of desperation. This was the first royally financed colonial attempt, and it was an absolute unit of an expedition. 11 ships sailed from Veracruz, carrying 1,500 souls. The vessels held 500 soldiers, 1,000 civilians, livestock, food, and hundreds of Nahua auxiliaries. It was the largest force ever assembled for such a task. It was a floating city designed to succeed where the starving walkers of the Narvaez and De Soto parties had failed. As I contemplate the manifest of this fleet, I feel a familiar, terrifying thrill. The sheer order of it soothes a chaotic itch in the back of my brain. There were elegant columns of supplies, careful ratios of biscuit to brisket, and precise allocations of magistrates. I found myself rereading the supply list for the 4th time. I muttered the quantities of dried chickpeas aloud, entranced by the beautiful, doomed symmetry of their preparation. They had accounted for everything. Or so they thought, as the loaded ships turned their prows toward the humid uncertainty of the Gulf. Grand plans, storm-wrecked dreams in Ochuse. I had spent an arguably unhealthy amount of time scrutinizing the sheer bureaucratic heft of Don Tristán de Luna y Arellano's departure from Veracruz, a logistical ballet involving noble cousins and royal credit lines. Now, tracing his route, I stood on the white quartz sands of Pensacola Bay, trying to superimpose those orderly manifests over the actual coast. This was meant to be the launch pad for a transcontinental highway. Luna's armada arrived here in August 1559, a formidable collection of 11, or 13, depending on which dusty chronicler you prefer, ships carrying 1,500 souls. The 500 soldiers likely felt entirely too warm in their armor, while the 1,000 colonists and servants expected a quick transition to subtropical ease. The bay was already on Spanish maps as Ochuse, a name recorded by Francisco Maldonado during the De Soto expedition 2 decades prior. Naturally, Luna rebranded it. Landing on August 14th or 15th, the vigil of the Feast of the Assumption, he formally christened the water Santa Maria Filipina and the settlement Santa María de Ochuse. In a single stroke of ceremonial efficiency, he secured patronage from both the Virgin Mary and King Philip II. The grand strategy required this bay to anchor an overland road stretching all the way to Santa Elena on the Atlantic coast, locking French interlopers out of the continent. The real estate reality of 1559 proved disappointing. The expedition encountered only a handful of native residents, who the Spanish assumed were fishermen. Hoping to avoid the public relations disasters of his predecessors, Luna ordered his men to practice kindness and distribute gifts. It was a noble gesture, though one gets the sense he was essentially handing out corporate swag to an empty room, realizing rather quickly that they had no local labor pool or tribute to exploit. Then the Gulf of Mexico delivered its seasonal verdict. On September 19th, barely a month after the colonists began uncrating their new lives, a massive hurricane struck the bay. A 24-hour vortex of wind and tidal surge turned the meticulously organized fleet into kindling. Accounts suggest the storm sank at least 7 of the ships, crushing the specific vessels acting as the floating pantry. Into the salt water went the massive stores of wheat flour, hardtack, wine and beef, intended to feed 1,500 people for a year. Instantly, the administrative goals of imperial expansion dissolved into a frantic scramble to avoid starvation. Stripped of his construction plans, Luna fell back on the survival playbook of the doomed expeditions before him. He sent men inland to hunt for groceries. In late September, a detachment of roughly 200 soldiers led by Major Mateo del Saus and Captain Cristobal de Arellano, flanked by 2 Dominican friars who presumably prayed for corn, marched north. They sought a rumored town called Nanipacana. Trekking 40 leagues across unpopulated river valleys, the journey resembled a death march through a botanical garden. After 45 days of slogging through the interior, word reached the starving coast in mid-November that Saus had found the settlement. Located on the Alabama River, Nanipacana boasted 80 houses. Hope surged through the Pensacola ranks until closer inspection revealed the buildings were decaying and the population depleted. The locals, baffled by yet another wave of metal-clad tourists, explained that the town had collapsed due to the depredations of other Spaniards who had passed through years earlier. The ghosts of Hernando de Soto's violent joyride through the southeast were still haunting the soil, leaving a hollowed-out landscape where Luna had projected his salvation. Desperation forces movement. In February or March of 1560, the bulk of the Luna expedition packed up their misery and relocated to the riverbank at Nanipacana, which they optimistically renamed Santa Cruz. They arrived late to their own rescue. The native residents, thoroughly educated on the habits of Spanish visitors, had abandoned the site and carried their food supplies into the woods. The colonists had merely swapped a starving beach for a starving riverbank. With famine settling in, a new detachment was ordered further north toward Coosa, a province remembered from the De Soto accounts as a land of agricultural plenty. Their survival now depended on retracing the steps of a disastrous past. As the chronicler Agustin Davila Padilla wrote of the soldiers' plight during this time, they were clinging to life by the very desire to preserve it. Captured paths. Mediators march to alliance. That desperate hunger followed the detachment north. Beyond the ruins of Nanipacana, where the colony's optimism had withered faster than the relentless Florida humidity could curl a linen ruff, the collective stomach of the expedition began to articulate a protest loud enough to rival the hurricane that had smashed the fleet. Major Mateo del Saus, whose job description had rapidly deteriorated from administrator of imperial expansion to manager of strategic starvation, executed a final desperation play. The column had to push toward the fabled granaries of Coosa. To navigate this unfamiliar terrain, the Spanish bypassed the smoky arquebus and the terrifyingly bearded priests. They deployed a solitary, unnamed native woman, My own quest to understand this ghost of the archives felt like a bizarre coastal construction project, requiring me to assemble a stained glass window from a pile of loose beach quartz. She enters the record as a captive. Hernando de Soto had seized her from her home in the paramount chiefdom of Coosa, near present-day Cartersville, Georgia. That area sits squarely on the modern Interstate 75 pilgrimage route for Southerners driving down to 30A. De Soto dragged her away during his violent entrada around 1540. He was a man whose approach to international diplomacy involved iron collars and burning things until they stopped resisting. He took her all the way to New Spain. There she was baptized. She was taught the Castilian tongue. She was molded into a cultural amphibian, creating a linguistic asset the Spanish found indispensably convenient. Now she was returning home, transformed from a former captive into the geographic oracle for Tristán de Luna's salvation. It is a historical paradox of staggering complexity that the survival of this second Spanish expedition relied entirely on a woman whose life had been shattered by the first. She was the living bridge between two disasters. She provided a singular point of continuity in an expedition otherwise unspooling from high-minded hubris and itchy mosquito bites. The column of 140 men trudged northward into the interior. They relied on her memory of a world that technically no longer existed. The irony was thicker than the air in the Tennessee Valley. The Spanish were expecting the agricultural utopia described by De Soto's chroniclers, a land heavy with maize and tribute. Instead, the Coosa woman guided them through a screaming silence. The landscape lacked the clanking armor and braggadocio of an advancing imperial force, offering only the unnerving quiet of abandonment. The grand towns were fragmented. The fields had surrendered to weeds. These were scars left by the disease and destabilization De Soto had brought to the region 2 decades prior. She was effectively leading a tour through a post-apocalyptic version of her own childhood. Despite the desolation, her value to the expedition was absolute. Acting as a quiet logistical guide, she and other native women advised the Spanish officers to carry their own rations rather than raiding the depleted local stores. It was a lesson in resource management that the conquistadors, blinded by their own magnificence, would never have deduced independently. When the column finally reached the diminished Coosa leadership, she facilitated a transaction born entirely of starvation. The Coosa recognized that these starving Europeans were essentially high-maintenance mercenaries with excellent weaponry. They struck a bargain. The deal was straightforward. The Spanish would eat, provided they agreed to fight. 50 Spanish soldiers were conscripted to join 300 Coosa warriors in a campaign against the Napoches, a rebellious tributary group near the Tennessee River that had decided to stop paying taxes. The combined force tracked the rebellion toward modern-day Chattanooga, Tennessee. Finding the first Napoche town abandoned, they pursued the group to an island in the river. This sanctuary was likely what is now McClellan Island. Realizing they were hopelessly outnumbered, the Napoches sued for peace. They agreed to return to vassal status and resumed paying tribute in the form of game, fruits, and nuts 3 times a year. It was a diplomatic masterstroke facilitated by the interpreter. She transformed the stumbling invaders into useful tools of local political enforcement. Based on an exhaustively rigorous analysis of 16th-century geopolitical leverage calculated against the caloric burn rate of wearing steel armor in the American South and adjusted for the inflation of Spanish ego, the conclusion was inescapable. The mighty conquistadors had been reduced to working for corn. Hurricane harvest, Luna's folly, Spain's retreat. While that Coosa interpreter brokered her desperate deal in the interior, my own route brought me back to the melancholy shores of Pensacola Bay. This was where the grand machinery of empire ground to a halt with the finality of a carriage shedding a wheel. Surveying the waterline, I realized the lunar expedition managed to fulfill 2 contradictory destinies. Don Tristán de Luna y Arellano ensured his settlement was memorialized permanently in stacks of angry litigation. At the same time, the physical colony vanished so completely that I was essentially staring at a parking lot of wet sand. Wind and rain certainly accelerated the collapse of this subtropical outpost, but the final stroke was a bureaucratic masterpiece. By January 30th, 1561, colonial authorities decided that Luna's inability to feed 1,000 people after a hurricane smashed his entire supply fleet into kindling was actually a managerial failure. There is a specific strain of dark humor in relieving a man of command for poor leadership when his current portfolio consists entirely of starving refugees and weather anomalies. Nevertheless, the official removal order came down. The decree cited substantial dissension among his followers, which was polite administrative phrasing for a mutiny driven by a collective preference to not starve to death. Luna surely appreciated the irony. He had previously begged to be relieved, only to be tempted into staying when Viceroy Velasco dangled the prospect of a Cuban governorship. On April 9, 1561, he boarded a ship bound for Havana and Spain to answer charges derived from his subordinates' complaints. He left behind an encampment that functioned less as an imperial settlement and more as a waiting room for the afterlife. Ángel de Villafañe arrived next as the replacement manager sent to rescue a failing franchise. Upon landing, Villafañe likely looked around the camp and asked a question that has plagued administrators for centuries. Exactly what assets am I supposed to be liquidating here? The residents of Ochuse had moved past the stage of basic rationing. They were subsisting on a diet of local shellfish and coastal forage. Having already boiled and eaten all the leather they possessed, the colonists occupied a landscape where they could neither walk comfortably nor chew actual meat, because the boots and the meals were exactly the same thing. Realizing that grass generated zero colonial revenue, Villafañe made the executive decision to abandon the site. He gathered the remaining 150 skeletons in training and ferried them to Havana. The Spanish crown saw things differently. Strictly adhering to the sunk cost fallacy doctrine of imperial exploration, authorities ordered Villafañe to take 75 men and try again at Santa Elena on the Atlantic coast. The resulting voyage went exactly as one might expect. Summer storms battered his ships and forced a miserable retreat to Mexico. The attempt proved once again that while a king can command men, the Atlantic Ocean takes orders from no one. By August 1561, the geopolitical game was over. Villafañe returned to Pensacola Bay to collect the final garrison of 50 soldiers he left behind, men presumably stationed as a placeholder in case the king changed his mind. With their removal, the Spanish completely abandoned the settlement. The failure was absolute. It was so complete in its logistical devastation that Spain looked at the northern Gulf Coast, checked its colonial ledger, and decided to ghost the entire region. Florida was deemed too volatile and hazardous. This administrative retreat resulted in a hiatus lasting nearly a century and a half. The long silence only ended in 1698, when Andrés de Areola returned to build the Presidio of Santa María de Galve to forestall French expansion. As for Don Tristán, he avoided perishing in the coastal swamps. He crossed back to New Spain, stripped of his title but keeping his life. He spent his remaining years in Mexico. He had been a wealthy heir, a celebrated captain of horse alongside Coronado, and a governor of a vast new territory. He ended his days as a disgruntled pensioner, dying in 1573. His final trajectory proved that the most terrifying obstacle an imperial conqueror could face was not an army of giants, but a devastating performance review. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 5, Beyond 7 Cities, Battered at Pensacola. The through line here is pretty clear. Spain kept sending expeditions fueled by rumors and golden expectations, and the land kept sending them back broken, hungry, and short one fleet. From Coronado's long walk to nowhere profitable, to Luna watching his ships splinter in Pensacola Bay, the pattern held, and what began as treasure hunting gradually became something more like reluctant geography lessons. Next chapter, the aftermath moves into courtrooms and legal wrangling, as conquistadors traded swords for lawsuits, and Spain's Florida frontier lurched forward through missions, raids, and imperial handoffs toward an ending written by treaty rather than conquest. If this journey has you wanting more, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors, and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Until next time, thanks for riding along on the Rise the Limit. Safe from the breached outfall and drying out in the beach condo, I spent the following days scrolling through colonial archives on my laptop, trying to decipher the paper trail of Spanish exploration. We tend to view the conquest of the Americas as a linear, bloody march of doom. Yet examining the records reveals something closer to a circular firing squad of litigation. Before the cannon fire fully faded, the real battle began with the furious scratching of quill on parchment. For every ounce of actual gold discovered, there were perhaps 3 pounds of legal briefs filed back in Seville. Bureaucracy fueled the madness of the expeditionary frontier, and the madness only bloated the bureaucracy. Passing this history feels less like reading an adventure novel and more like auditing the tax returns of a territorial crime syndicate. The chaos was built into the system. The Spanish crown possessed a habit of handing out overlapping contracts and vaguely defined borders to men with massive egos and very sharp swords. This hemisphere-wide turf war spilled from the coastal swamps directly into the stuffy chambers of the Council of the Indies. There, the most dangerous weapon was a well-timed lawsuit. Consider the case of Juan Ponce de León. In 1508, he settled Puerto Rico, thinking he had secured a comfortable retirement package. Diego Colón, son of the original admiral, soon arrived in Hispaniola carrying a hereditary grievance the size of a galleon. Diego argued his father's contract covered everything, including islands his father had never even seen. The dispute bypassed military glory entirely and focused squarely on who controlled the regional labor and the paycheck. Diego appointed his own cronies, Juan Cerón and Miguel Diaz, to take over the island. Ponce displayed the aggressive conflict resolution skills that made the era famous by arresting them both and shipping them back to Spain. The resulting pleitos colombinos, or Columbus lawsuits, dragged on for years. The king eventually solved the problem by giving Ponce a new contract to explore Bimini and Florida. It was essentially a royal severance package to get him away from the Columbus family, a logistical absurdity suggesting the early mapping of North America was largely an administrative solution to a hostile work environment. Then there is the saga of Hernán Cortés, a commander who treated royal decrees as friendly suggestions. When the governor of Cuba realized Cortés planned to monopolize the wealth of Mexico, he sent Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest him in 1520. It did not go well. Cortés actually paused his dismantling of the Aztec Empire to defeat Narváez at Chempoala. Narváez was thrown in jail for 2 years and lost an eye during the scuffle. Upon his release, Narváez skipped any formal duel. He instead sued Cortés for treason and demanded cash for the missing eye. Suing a man for high treason because he maimed you while you were trying to arrest him contains a certain twisted logic in a society obsessed with honor. The crown settled the dispute by giving the one-eyed Narváez the title of Adelantado for La Florida, a deadly, swamp-filled consolation prize that would predictably kill him. It was a golden parachute that failed to open. The litigation did not stop when the explorers died. It simply moved to probate court. The lawsuit between Isabel de Bobadilla, the widow of Hernando de Soto, and her husband's former business partner, Hernan Ponce de Leon, is particularly grasping. After de Soto died in the American interior, his partner sued the estate. He claimed de Soto had bullied him into giving up half a treasure of gold and silver in Cuba, amounting to some 8,000 castellanos, before leaving for the Gulf Coast. Isabel fired back, arguing the partner had stayed behind and lived comfortably on their joint assets worth 200,000 ducats. It became a bitter, ugly fight over the alleged dregs of a great fortune, proving that even after the total collapse of a deadly expedition, someone was always left to bill for the expenses. Maria de Valenzuela, the tenacious wife of the ill-fated Narvaez, also took to the courts. After her husband vanished into the Gulf of Mexico, she sued her associate Hernando de Ceballos to recover the funds and ships she had poured into a failed rescue mission. She proved so effective that the Council of the Indies ordered Ceballos held in chains. Even Francisco Vásquez de Coronado faced charges after failing to find the 7 cities of gold. He was eventually cleared, but his field commander was fined for abuses. The common soldiers who lost their life savings on the trip had no one to sue for fraud but the horizon itself. The legal drama of the era concluded with a dark irony in the case of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. After surviving his trek across North America, he became governor of Rio de la Plata. There, he made the frantic error of treating the indigenous people with documented humanity. This enraged the local slave-owning settlers who preferred their labor force unpaid and overworked. They arrested him on trumped-up charges of misrule and shipped him back to Spain in 1545. He had survived shipwrecks, starvation, and captivity largely by embracing the better angels of his nature, and for this, his own countrymen banished him to North Africa. He offered the New World mercy, and the Old World handed him a sentence. It was a stark warning to any official who strayed from the extraction model, creating a paranoid, punishing environment that would isolate and stall the expansion of the northern frontier for decades to come. 30A's Ghost, Imperial Echoes on Shifting Sands. I finally closed a laptop, mentally departing the stuffy, velvet-draped courtrooms of the Council of the Indies where dead men fought battles with parchment rather than steel. Walking back out into the blinding reality of the Florida Panhandle, I immediately found my shins losing a high-stakes class-action lawsuit filed by an aggressive patch of saw palmetto. It was a litigious scrub intent on enforcing its territorial rights with prickly subpoenas. I wanted to locate the physical ghosts of an empire that had tried, and largely failed, to tame this sandy void. Specifically, I was looking for the Spanish mission frontier, an era spanning roughly 1650 to 1704. Yet the landscape before me offered nothing but wind, salt spray, and the haughty silence of nature. It turns out that for the modern 30A coastal strip, the Spanish Empire was less of an occupying force and more of a vague rumor. The historical record confirms this stretch of South Walton County sat distinctly outside the primary mission zone. The main Spanish operation was the Apalachee province, an agricultural center of Franciscan piety anchored miles to the east around present-day Tallahassee. This coastal corridor, by contrast, was an ambiguous frontier. It was a geopolitical maybe where the mission system brushed the shoreline but never took root. There were no limestone chapels here, there were no friars lecturing the seagulls on theology, and there were no formal compounds. Absence of colonial masonry does not equal isolation. While the friars stayed comfortable in their inland cloisters, the native inhabitants of the coast actively imported distinctively European clutter. Archaeological digs at massive sites like 4 Mile Point on Choctawhatchee Bay, which descended from the ancient mound builders, have unearthed a Fort Walton village layer teeming with proof of exchange. Spanish artifacts from the mid-1600s, including glass beads, metal fragments and olive jar sherds, are mixed thoroughly into the native soil. It suggests a relationship based on indirect contact, a system allowing coastal villagers to acquire the latest in European fashion accessories without the burdensome requirement of hosting a resident priest. Glass beads whispered of gods never seen. This influence traveled on the tip of a spear as well. The Spanish mission system extended its reach westward through military proxies. In 1676 and 1677, reports described mission-allied Apalachee and Chickato warriors marching west. They crossed what historians plausibly identify as the Choctawhatchee River near this very region. They were en route to attack a fortified Chisca village, proving that while Spanish boots rarely touched the ground, Spanish geopolitics certainly did. The nearby Chickato missions themselves were fragile outposts. They possessed a tragically short lifespan due to recurrent revolts and raids, flickering out before they could leave a permanent mark on the western county grid. Ultimately, this era of tenuous contact ended with a catastrophe that emptied the map. The violent colonial rivalry of Queen Anne's War drove an absolute collapse of the frontier in 1704. British forces, aided by their Muskogee allies, swept down from the north and systematically dismantled the Spanish mission chain. The devastation was thorough. By that year, the Apalachee province was described as effectively empty. Spanish scouts in 1705 reported finding neither people nor cattle in what had once been the mission heartland. The friars retreated. The soldiers withdrew. By 1706, the Spanish presence in Florida had shriveled back to the fortified enclaves of St. Augustine and Pensacola. I stood atop the condo, looking out over a landscape that, from 1704 to 1763, became a sparsely settled wilderness defined by the vacuum of imperial collapse. The friars had preached of eternal salvation. They bequeathed only a temporary void. How much history simply washes away when there is no one left to file the paperwork? Frontiers fall. Florida's mission systems eclipse. The answer, apparently, is almost all of it. As historian Michael Gannon writes in The Cross in the Sand, the 1704 assault virtually obliterated the chain of Spanish missions, leaving behind little but smoke and silence. This destruction was largely the work of a South Carolina governor named James Moore, whose raids turned the Florida Panhandle into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. It was the kind of stillness that usually follows a very loud and messy argument at a family reunion. Only in this case, the family was the Spanish Empire, and the argument involved muskets and torches. For the region that would become 30A, the violence created a long quiet. It became a massive, sparsely occupied buffer zone between competing empires. Trudging north from the dunes into the deep piney woods, I could almost feel the landscape holding its breath. It was a stillness born of trauma, a vast geopolitical pause button pressed firmly down while the great European powers regrouped. West of those woods in Pensacola, things were considerably louder and wetter. The Spanish had re-established a fort there in 1698, but maintaining it proved to be an exhausting labor of bureaucratic incompetence and bad luck. In 1719, during the War of the Quadruple Alliance, a conflict that sounds like a complicated board game no one wants to play, the French captured Pensacola. They kindly gave it back in 1722. The real enemy, however, was not the French. It was the weather. On November 3, 1752, a disastrous hurricane struck Santa Rosa Island, scrubbing the settlement from the map with the efficiency of a wet rag on a chalk slate. The survivors, presumably tired of swimming in their living rooms, moved the principal settlement to the mainland to establish the site of modern Pensacola. Meanwhile, in the eastern capital of St. Augustine, the mood was less wet and more starving. The annual government subsidy, the situado, was the colonial equivalent of a check perpetually in the mail. By 1735, the shortages of food and supplies were so severe that Governor Morral had to swallow his Castilian pride and permit citizens to buy goods from English traders. It was a desperate absurdity. They were purchasing survival supplies from the very people they were building forts to keep out, a distinct irony unlikely to be lost on anyone eating English hardtack in a Spanish plaza. In a final burst of industry, Governor Heredia supported a new venture in April 1756 to cure this grinding poverty. He ordered the manufacture of naval stores. Colonists began tapping the abundant pine forests for tar and pitch, commodities the British Navy desperately needed to waterproof its expanding fleet. It was a brilliant economic pivot, an ambitious industrial gamble of sticky resin intended to finally save the colony's finances. But history, much like my attempts at home repair, has an irritating habit of ruining good plans. Just as the tar flowed and the economy flickered with life, the geopolitical floor dropped out. The 7 Years' War concluded, and the 1763 Treaty of Paris redrew the map. Spain lost everything. The territory was handed over to Great Britain, emptying out the remaining Spanish towns and leaving the pine trees to new management. The Castilian banner fell to the Union Jack, and the 30A backcountry simply traded one distant, indifferent empire for another as the British began to survey their newly acquired frontier. Florida's shifting sands, colonial fortunes, and frontier paths. Why do empires treat entire subcontinents like unwanted fruitcakes during the holidays? The 1763 treaty that permitted those British surveyors to map this frontier was the result of a massive pragmatic compromise. European diplomats had decided Havana was a prize worth keeping, making Florida essentially a throw-in token to sweeten the deal for Great Britain. I stood on the edge of the dune lands, looking out over the emerald water, considering the sheer bureaucratic audacity required to swap a wealthy tropical metropolis for a massive, swampy peninsula filled with mosquitoes and ambiguity. From 1763 to 1783, the region now known as 30A entered its British interlude, a 20-year blip that feels less like a historical era and more like a gap year where London tried to find itself. Britain immediately sliced their new acquisition into 2 provinces separated by the Apalachicola River. East Florida kept its capital at St. Augustine, and West Florida operated out of Pensacola. This dividing line placed the Choctawhatchee Basin and the wild backcountry of the Panhandle firmly under West Florida's jurisdiction. Formal possession proceeded with military efficiency. Captain John Hedges arrived in St. Augustine in July and Lieutenant Colonel Augustine Prevost took Pensacola in August. By February 1764, the Spanish had entirely evacuated, packing up their belongings and leaving behind a "for rent" sign on an entire colony. London tried to make the best of the geography. Administrators pursued an aggressive policy of recruiting colonists by dangling free land grants like carrots before a hesitant public. They hoped to jump-start export-oriented businesses, but settlement in this remote corridor was slow to materialize. It turns out that pitch, tar, and quartz sand were not quite the allure the Crown hoped they would be. In 1767, the government even shifted the northern boundary up to the Yazoo River to include valuable districts like Natchez, artificially puffing up the importance of Pensacola. When the American Revolution began in 1775, the 13 northern colonies were busy throwing tea into harbors and writing spirited declarations. The Floridas decided to sit the conflict out. Both East and West Florida remained awkwardly loyal to the Crown, functioning as a haven for refugees. Scottish immigrants and persecuted loyalists fleeing the chaos in the Carolinas and Georgia drifted down into the area. They turned the Panhandle into a quiet sanctuary for people who thought revolution was a bit rude. The 30A corridor was not a battlefield. It was a wilderness logic puzzle of dunes and longleaf pine, where the local economy relied on Native American trade rather than gunpowder. Traffic moved along the inland river corridors, following a network of trading paths that defied straight lines. In 1778, British Captain David Holmes and surveyor Joseph Purcell documented the Ekanachati trading path. They led a column that included 10 white officers and 22 Upper Creek warriors across the pinelands of future Walton and Bay counties. The party eventually boarded a boat at the mouth of the Choctawhatchee River, surviving an arduous trek across the hinterland. Scottish traders like Timothy Kinnard operated in the basin during this same period. Kinnard worked under the umbrella of Panton, Leslie and Company, a firm that managed the British supply chain for the southeastern tribes with the monopoly power of a modern tech giant, but with more beaver pelts. The British lease on the property expired violently. Spain, operated out of neighboring Louisiana, sensed an opportunity to settle old factional scores and declared war on Britain in 1780. Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez, a man who treated enemy fortifications as personal insults, swept out across the region. He captured Mobile in 1780 and then turned his gaze toward the capital. The siege of Pensacola in 1781 was the bloody climax of this imperial wrestling match. It ended abruptly on May 10th, when a Spanish howitzer shell struck the Queen's Redoubt powder magazine. The resulting explosion killed over 100 defenders instantly and leveled the fortification, proving that in war, timing is debatably more important than strategy. Galvez accepted the British surrender, halting their short rule on the Gulf Coast. He then went on to capture the Bahamas in 1782, giving Spain a stack of bargaining chips for the peace table. The 1783 Treaty of Paris formally ended the American Revolutionary War and returned both East and West Florida to Spain. By 1784, the British had finalized their evacuation, leaving the Mosquitoes to learn Spanish once again. Real estate flipping is an ancient, messy art. Florida's gambit, empires, claims, and cession. Returning to the sandy dominion of Florida after the British evacuation felt less like a homecoming for Spain and more like inheriting a grand colonial estate where the roof leaks and the neighbors are heavily armed. My own expedition continued through this chaotic interregnum. I traversed the stately Choctawhatchee Basin and navigated the treacherous thickets of prickly pear behind the towering dunes of the Emerald Coast, barely surviving the dreaded plateau of the perpetual Wi-Fi dead zone. It was 1783, and Spain had regained possession of East and West Florida via the Treaty of Paris, theoretically restoring the glory of the Conquistadors but effectively just changing the stationery. In practice, this second Spanish period was an exercise in administrative ghost hunting. Spain simply lacked the personnel and the pesetas to garrison the vast wilderness of the Panhandle. Their sovereign authority barely extended beyond the shouting distance of St. Augustine and Pensacola. To manage the interior, they outsourced the local economy back to a familiar entity, the Scottish firm Panton, Leslie and Company. The same trading monopoly that had dominated the basin during the British years simply pivoted to serve the Spanish crown, operating like a multinational corporation with muskets. They controlled the Native American trade from their sprawling Pensacola warehouses, creating a strange reality where a Spanish province was economically powered by Scots and inhabited largely by Creeks, Uches, and the emerging Seminole culture. It was a resilient coalition of refugees and escaped slaves seeking freedom in the forgotten spaces of the map. By the turn of the 19th century, the geopolitical temperature had risen from mildly uncomfortable to active volcano. The United States purchased Louisiana in 1803 and unilaterally decided that West Florida belonged on the receipt. Spain politely but firmly filed that claim in the bin. Diplomatic notes, however, could not hold back the tide. American settlers began crossing into the territory to stage revolts and shout about liberty, which was usually convenient code for land acquisition. This era of filibustering, which in those days meant unauthorized military land grabs rather than talking until the Senate falls asleep, eroded Spanish borders faster than the Gulf tide eats a sandcastle. The chaos boiled over during the War of 1812, when the British briefly crashed on Pensacola's couch to annoy the southern United States. This strategic nuisance drew the ire of General Andrew Jackson, a man who treated international borders with the same casual disregard a cat has for a closed door. In November 1814, Jackson stormed into Spanish West Florida, expelled the British, and made it clear that Spanish neutrality was a polite fiction. The violence escalated in 1816 with the destruction of the Negro fort on the Apalachicola River. A heated cannonball struck the fort's powder magazine. The resulting explosion instantly obliterated a community of free blacks and escaped slaves who had built a sanctuary in this contested borderland. Jackson returned in 1818 for the First Seminole War. He captured Pensacola and Fort Barrancas with a swagger that suggested he owned the place, which, for all intents and purposes, he did. Spain, exhausted by independence movements sweeping across Latin America, realized their Florida project had become a money pit of epic proportions. They finally decided to cut their losses. The nations signed the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, exchanging the Floridas for the dismissal of $5 million in American claims, forming a bargain composed mostly of paperwork and debt forgiveness. On July 17, 1821, the final act of this humid drama played out in Plaza Ferdinand VII in Pensacola. The transfer of sovereignty is often framed with the oil-painting solemnity of a changing of the guard, complete with respectful officers saluting the orderly flow of international law. Stripped of its pageantry, the moment was essentially a glorified eviction ceremony. A tired tenant finally handing over the keys to a landlord who had been banging on the door for 20 years, with both parties silently acknowledging that the rent was never really paid on time anyway. As the Spanish colors came down for the last time, ending 256 years of imperial adventure that began with Narvaez and De Soto, the Stars and Stripes rose, and the 30A corridor officially became American territory. From conquistadors haggling over spoils before the Council of the Indies to Andrew Jackson strong-arming Spain out of Pensacola, the 30A frontier kept changing hands whether anyone on that coastline wanted it to or not, and I find something deeply relatable in that. History rarely asks permission before it rewrites the map. Next chapter, we trade the courtrooms and cannon fire for something altogether different, following the sunrise along scenic Highway 30A, where bottlenose dolphins work the seagrass, bull sharks patrol the tannin-dark outfalls, and sea turtles navigate by magnetic memory, because the wildlife on this coast has its own long history of holding on through chaos. If this journey is sparking something for you, the full travelogue, Conquistadors and Condos, is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, and if you want bonus content and a look behind the scenes, come find me on Patreon. On the Rise the Limit, we keep moving.